This is Father Bonaventure Chapman.
And this is Father Gregory Pine.
Welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly or otherwise donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcast. Father Gregory, this is old school because we're recording. It's not a live splaining or a guest splaining, and yet we're recording in situ. You're in Switzerland and I'm in Washington, D.C., because mistakes were made and technology did its thing and what have you. But it reminded me of sock hops. And I want to ask you the question of, does this also remind you of sock hops? Or do you have any idea what a sock hop is?
I have many thoughts. First thought is I have no idea what a sock hop is. Second thing is I want to hear what you think this has to do with sock hops.
Yeah. So sock hops, one might think that this is like hopping around in socks, and it kind of is, because that's how language works in general. It has some relationship to what it's asking for. But sock hops were, any viewer who is older than 35 would know about sock hops, I think, because they were all the rage when I was in elementary school. It was a way, and it's one of those things like I wish I had a time machine. You could go back and find out like elementary school principals and teachers, like when they said, let's have a sock hop. Because what is a sock hop? I think a sock hop is a way in the 1950s that high schoolers got together to dance. So it was like an informal dance. And it would be on the gym floor in a school. And so you would take off your shoes so that you didn't scuff up the floor. So it's called a sock hop. Now, interestingly enough, that was the shoes being taken off was not the most important thing to the sock hop experience for me. Well, there's plenty of things, but the essence of it, I suppose, the basin of the sock hop was more about what you wore. Because it wasn't what you wore, it's like what your parents dressed you up as, because we did these in elementary school, like 5th grade or 6th grade or 7th grade of middle school or something. And the guys you'd wear jeans. So obviously I didn't go to many of these. And a white t-shirt, sometimes a leather jacket. But if you had the white t-shirt, you would also take like a box of chalk or something, and you would roll it up on the sleeve like cigarettes, because that's how apparently 50s people would go to sock hops with their cigarettes rolled up in their sleeves. This is all parents doing this. This becomes like this kind of creepy, like let's dress up our kids like as dolls sort of things. And the girls would wear what were called, try this. Do you know what poodle skirts are?
I think I do, actually. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So poodle skirt, it looks like it's like a felt big fabric, but that could just because this was bought at Party City, and has like a poodle on it. Now, I cannot explain why this happens. But anyway, I was so sock hops, and so the relation is throwing back to the past, and in like fun kind of, meta ways. And in this way, although we're not recording on top of a garbage can, in our rooms, just folks, go back and you can watch these early episodes. If you think, my gosh, these guys are just incompetent, the technology is not that good, go back to those earlier episodes and just realize what was happening there. I mean, I think we were talking on cans attached with strings. So we are returning for just a moment with this episode on that. But the other, any thoughts on that before I make the awesome switch and transition?
I have many thoughts. Yeah, you actually asked me before we started recording the episode whether or not there were any announcements, and I said no because I was experiencing haste. Not that I myself was hasty. I would never assign that vicious disposition to this individual who is like a soul dragging a corpse through life. So
double
I
transition
was
point.
in haste. Yeah, exactly. But we can mention the fact that applications for the all-comers retreats remain open until, I think it's June 2nd. So far, we've received over 100 applications, which is awesome. And I think we have like 116 spots. So the time is upon us. Well, the time is drawing nigh, as I once sang in like 5th grade choir, but which is also a sock hop relative point. And then the other thing was, I was thinking about this, also kind of oldie-timey. Both you and I've noticed this in the past 2 years, that when it comes to the intonation of words in the middle of a sentence, actually in all points of a sentence, I think we're kind of losing our bearings. And I think in part it reflects the fact that we've been closeted in our rooms, working on our dissertations for so long. So what I'm
Yeah.
about to say is, with all due respect to homeschool families, whom I have great esteem for, great regard for, especially at Steubenville, how they acquitted themselves admirably, far beyond us publicly educated individuals. But one way you could tell a homeschooler was that they knew how to pronounce like 99.9% of words, but every once in a while they didn't know how to pronounce a word because they hadn't heard it spoken. They'd only read it previously. And sometimes it'd be things that you might otherwise know. And I think that
Sarcophagus.
yeah, exactly. We're experiencing some of this in our own lives. I've lost my
Mm.
bearings on how to stress words in sentences.
I feel like a criticism is about to come on me, but I'm ready for it.
No, it's just at the beginning of the episodes, both of us are just like,
This.
"Hello and welcome to God's."
Explaining. Yeah, it's true. Well, I think I try to vary that up. All right, let me draw together these strings here, and say also. So with the sock hop reference, 2 points about this. One, there will be yes, listeners, at this coming retreat, the all comers thing. Yes, I want to announce it here. We're going to have a sock hop. Father Jacob Birchin will actually be the one who will be organizing that. He'll be wearing a suit and wandering around with to make sure that you are dancing appropriately. So if that doesn't just blow the invitation, the applications out of the water, I don't know what will. I have no idea what will. Okay, but the second thing is, the other actually important element to sock hops was that it involved two genders. No one went to sock hops with just guys or just gals. It involved two genders. And this episode, as you might have noticed, is Do Souls Have Genders? Because it's a fun one in a way. And it could go on for hours. So it's going to be a shame because we only have 24 minutes left. But that's fine. This will be an open foray. Because at this, I think actually Father Greg and I probably, I don't want to say disagree, but we have different intuitions about this kind of thing because we follow, in this aspect, at least two different Thomistic thinkers. One, St. Thomas, who is generally a Thomistic thinker, not always, not always. And then the second, Edith Stein, who is a Thomistic thinker, not always, but sometimes. But we thought it's a good topic, not only because it's fun to see the kind of differences, but also, and the fact that you can have differences, some differences you can have. We'll get to the Council of Vienna soon enough. But also because it's topical in the fact that if you haven't noticed, gender is kind of tricky today, Used to be pretty simple, it seemed like. But today, with transgender stuff, it's a little trickier. And we don't want to paper over, the kind of difficulties and the psychological maladies and those problems and concerns. And people struggling with this, especially our listeners, it's very possible that they know someone, you might know someone who has experience and issues involving around these things. At the same time, we're going to back off of that and just talk about like gender from a philosophical, you could say, aspect and more abstract way or something. So we won't have any particular solutions. This isn't about the transgender thing. If you want to see that, talk about that or hear about that, we did an episode with Godsplaining, the two of us did with
Brandon Vaught.
Brandon Vaught, who's excellent, and it's really helpful to talk about that stuff. We're just going to go abstract, talked about do souls have gender, which in a sense we could say actually the real question is, what is the cause of gender? Is it matter or form? But let's get into all that stuff. So Father Gregory, though, before we get into specifically at St. Thomas on this, who's super helpful, maybe give us a gender sex thing, and then maybe I'll talk about, or you can talk about too, but I'll talk about like what a soul is for a second from a Thomistic kind of, from our Catholic, I should say, perspective. So want to give us a quick bearing on gender, sex, and just a heuristic or something.
Sure thing. I mean, I think a good introduction to this can be found at the aforementioned Godsplaining episode with Brandon Vaught, and he does the work of making those distinctions, which I think are super helpful and super clear. And insofar as many of you will have already listened to that episode because it only came out a couple of months ago, maybe what I could say is like that our approach to these things is typically top down. So we go from those most abstract principles to those most concrete principles when it comes to talking about human beings. So, you'll hear Catholic conversations where we talk about the fact that we're made to the image and likeness of God. And in the Christian tradition, that's bound up with the fact that we have an intellect and a will, right? Or a mind and a heart, depending on how you want to describe it. So these spiritual intellectual capacities, which break us open to realities beyond ourselves in a way that's distinct among material creatures. So animals don't have this, plants don't have this, rocks don't have this. And so we'll talk about being made to the image and likeness of God, and we focus then about on intellect and will. But as human beings, obviously, we are rational animals. So we have the bodily element as well, not just spiritual, but we also have this bodily element. And so you hear then talk about what it means to be a body soul or a soul body composite, if you've come across that type of language. But it's not like we're souls trapped in a body, or we're bodies kind of toting around souls. We're one thing, a body soul composite. And when you get into conversations about matter, about the fact that when this soul is composed with this matter becomes a human body, then that introduces further questions still. So like, how is it that we are male and female? At what point does that enter into the equation? And I think that's kind of the question that we're broaching here.
Yeah, that's great. It's good. It's good to distinguish when we talk about souls. As Catholics, because of the Council of Vienne, 1303, I think, defines Zedenziner 902 that we believe that the soul is the form of the body. So this is what you might hear the jargon as hylomorphism. So some account of hylomorphism, and that means that's like you could say between a crass materialistic view that the soul is just kind of like what we call the body. You could have materialism. Most of the people you meet out there today are kind of materialists. They could be materialists. Then on the other extreme, though, would be the kind of ghost in the machine view, which Gilbert Ryle in The Conception of Mind in the 1950s ascribed to Descartes. False. It's false that it's ascribed to Descartes. It is true that he ascribed it to Descartes. But this, which I think actually is the other common position, is like the soul is this little ghost figure, and he's driving a flesh cage, and like when you die, you hear this like you lose 9 grams or something, and that's the weight of the soul, and it's like the soul is this kind of other substance. So you're these two things. I guess it's also kind of like Independence Day, where there's the alien body shell, and then but when you crack it open, there's that little guy inside. And that's in the mind or something. So that's the other view. That is not allowed. You do not, as Catholics, want to believe that. That leads to all sorts of problems. It's just as bad, maybe worse than the materialistic one. Our soul as the form of the body means it's related intimately, and that's where we're cashing out there, as Father Gregory said, though. But Catholics, we believe this sort of thing, and so does Descartes. He says soul is a form of the body, but that is a different issue. But so let's once we got this pared down, you might say, well, darn, the gender stuff is tricky today. I got to go to a sock hop. So let me arm myself intellectually with an account of gender from St. Thomas's perspective. So so Father Gregory, how does St. Thomas approach this sort of question and gender, and where does that come in? And maybe then, if you want to get into the criticisms of him, I suppose, feel free to answer those as well. But if you don't, I'll mention some stuff.
You will. Let me try my best to be brief, and then you can pose some objections, and we can suss it out there. So we talked about man, human beings are a body-soul composite. And so St. Thomas ascribes much to this kind of reciprocity, or this mutual implication. I don't know the best words whereby to describe it, but I think you get what I'm saying. So we as human beings are embodied souls or ensouled bodies, but we're one thing. And in St. Thomas's estimation, the soul is more noble. The body exists for the soul. And so the soul has, this, what would one say, this kind of capacity, or this principiality. That is a word that has never before been said on Godsplaining. So I'm glad to bring that to you here for the first time.
The verb of that, principing?
Principialize? Don't worry about it. Okay, so we'll talk about the soul as the form of the body, or the formal cause, which makes the thing to be what it is. So I said previously, like the matter, what we're talking about here, it's not a human body until such time as it's informed by a human soul. So like when you die and your soul departs, or your soul and your body separate, we don't really refer to that body as much or anymore as a human body. We refer to it by a different name, namely a corpse. And then as it goes through, stages of decay, it becomes less so recognizable. You see where this is going. Okay. So the basic idea here is that by virtue of our souls, we're rational, and that by virtue of our bodies, we're animal. That's to cut it a little too clean, but you get what I'm saying. And basically that we are gendered by our bodies, because gender is a kind of biological or animalistic fact. So just thinking of separated substances, angels, they don't have genders, right? St. Thomas will say that angels are each their own species for cool reasons, which we won't entertain at present, but that
Yep.
we are gendered by our bodies. Now, that doesn't mean to say that your soul is like an angel, or that your soul is kind of abstract, or even kind of, what would the word be here, impersonal, to the extent that it has no real relation to a body. No, there's a real mutuality or reciprocity which arises from this body-soul composite, such that the fact of your biological, state, the fact that you are gendered as a male or as a female, kind of resonates, as it were, through your soul. One way we see that is like in emotions. This isn't going to fall into crass gender stereotypes, but St. Thomas will say that the emotions or the passions are a kind of biological feature of our lives. He says, we see them in animals too. But then he says each of them have a kind of higher resonance. So it's not just like we experience love animalistically, we also experience it spiritually, but there's a real relationship between the animal and the rational experience. And so I use the word resonance, but what we're talking about is a kind of bottom-up effect, such that the way that we're constituted materially has genuine, it kind of ramifies through, principiality and ramifies. Today is a great day. It ramifies through the whole of our life. So that's basic intro. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I don't think the cool thing about St. Thomas is he has such a unified account. It's nice that you keep the body and the soul together, to keep the formal and the material aspects, such that we don't have this weird separation, such that you say, like, I wonder if I'm actually this, although I appear to be this. Like, you can be disguised to yourself. That's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah.
One of the dangers with Thomas, I think, let's put it this way. Everyone has to bite bullets at some point, and every position, especially at the most metaphysical, basic levels of things, have like tensions, maybe was the best word for it, or like things. And I guess one of my concerns, or at least my tensions with St. Thomas, is that it does make gender seem something a little too materialistic. My general thing is that matter does a whole lot for Thomas. So material stuff does a whole lot for him. And the thing is, matter is a principle of potency. We're going to keep using more big words here. It's not a principle of determination. It's a principle of receptivity and such. It doesn't have an active sense to it, unless we want to give matter some active sense. And then we're moving further and further away from Thomistic accounts. And yet gender, my masculinity, or someone else's femininity, seems to have an active component to it. Like, it seems to have something you act out of gender in a different way than the receptivity. What do I mean by that? I mean that it seems to me, or let's put it this way, it seems like there are ways of acting and thinking and loving that seem to be distinctly characteristic of men and women. Right, that it seems like my way of interacting with the world is distinctively characteristic of me as a man, perhaps, and maybe a woman would be similar. And it is true that, for instance, my way of interacting with the world depends on my height, how tall I am, sort of thing, and maybe my skin color, in terms of like getting suntanned, or even more like whether I'm left-handed or right-handed. But it seems weird to put my masculinity in the category of, in the area of like height, skin color, handedness, or some kind of material thing, right? Because material things are like constraints on activity, it seems like to me. The matter constrains, in a sense, or shapes or conditions the spirit, the soul, formal causes. But it seems like my masculinity and femininity doesn't constrain my soul. So it's not like I could also be a better florist or something. Like I had more powers of knowing and loving if only I didn't have this male body. But it seems like it actually speaks out of that. So that's just kind of first pass on that. And then we maybe talk about Stein on how she kind of thinks about that.
Let me volley back just real quickly
Yeah.
and then send it to you for Stein, because we're actually scheduled to zoom in with a Nashville Dominican Sisters fourth grade class here shortly. So we got to get
Yeah.
down to the serious business of just mucking it up on Zoom. So my first thought is that I think that sometimes we have difficulty envisioning what it would mean for matter to, as it were, the word that I used was like resonate, for the effects of
Mm-hmm.
matter to resonate through the spiritual dimension. And I think
No,
that
that's
St.
right.
Thomas's account of the passions is one helpful place in which we find this to be true. So he has
Yeah.
distinct vocabulary for the more animalistic and then for the more spiritualistic experiences. So for like love, he says amor in the lower register and he says dilexio in the higher register. For sadness, he has, like dolor in the lower register and tristitia in the higher register. For joy, he has like what would delectatio in the lower register and then gaudium in the higher register. So he recognizes the fact that these are distinct, but that they're related, or at the very least, they're not unrelated. Um, so he doesn't try to pin down the resonance, but I think that that's where we can benefit from the phenomenological account of Edith Stein. I was
Mm-hmm.
talking to some students the other day, and I was thinking, for instance, about the fact, okay, so women tend to have a smaller frame. They tend to be weaker. They tend to be less
Mm-hmm.
skilled in matters of, like speed and strength and blah, whatever, you get it. So that's just statistically true. It's not saying anything about any individual. But because it's statistically true, I think women tend to share an experience which men don't tend to share. So, like, for instance, you're in a big city and it's time for you to go to public transportation to make your way home. It's late at night. It's a weekend. As a man, you think to yourself, cool, which podcast am I going to listen to? As a woman, you think to yourself, am I going to make it home alive?
Uh-huh.
So I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
a very different
Mm-hmm.
experience and it's widely shared. And that's something that doesn't need to be explained to members of the same sex or same gender, however we're using the particular word here, but we tend to graph them on.
Yeah.
So CF, Brandon Vaught episode. And I think I said graph when I meant graft, but I've already used ramifies and principiality. So it's just no holds bar at this point.
I thought about Steffi
Um,
Graf, so yeah.
yeah, perfect. So that common experience, uh, it speaks to this resonance of that kind of
Mm-hmm.
like animal to the spiritual. And as a result, I think it creates a common culture, which can be identified in distinct modes of thinking. And I think where we see this most exaltedly, and this leads into Edith Stein's account, is in the fact that, women can bear children. So she talks about
Yeah.
how the identity of a woman, the kind of mission of a woman is always related to the fact that she's a daughter, she's a bride, she's a mother in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
And so this relationship to her own biology and the biology of the children that she could conceivably conceive, bring into this world, nurture, raise, love, that has real profound, like biological consequences, which do indeed resonate in a spiritual way. So that send it back to you then, and you can talk more about Edith Stein.
Yeah, yeah. So no, I think you're right, and I think it also distinguishes the distinction between men and women in the experience of the world, the phenomenological account, as you say, in being like shorter, slower, or whatever crass stereotypes, like just physical aspects that then shape color how you experience the world. I think that's exactly what the Thomistic account would go, and I think it's right and true and profound. Edith Stein wants to push just a step further though, and say actually it's not just that these things condition us here, but actually, as you say, in the nature of me. So in the nature of being a woman, it's not just nature of being a human that then I experience it womanly, but that I have a female nature in a way that my thinking and my willing is aimed towards different objects in a way. So you talked about helpmate or bride or spouse and mother. And Edith Stein thinks these are if I look at my experience as a woman, she says, I realized that women, not just statistically, or I should say statistically, because essentially are oriented to the world in terms of, she says, living and towards living in personal things, whereas men are oriented towards kind of object things first. And two, she says, I have a natural or an inner orientation to the world for the whole, to take care, to gather together, this sort of thing. Whereas men tend to be more about the parts kind of thing. Now, you can initially think this is a crass stereotype. And the trick with phenomenology is the proof's in the pudding. You got to decide, is this true? Like, it's not like a logical deduction. It's a question of, is this, when I think about my acts in the world, do I think about them this way? And Stein's account is she says, when I think about being a woman, I think about a man, but think about her being a woman and acting, and I root my actions of knowing and loving and what I'm oriented towards from the inside out as opposed to from the outside in, which means that she then says things like, my female nature, it is part of my nature to be a woman, in a way that it's not part of my nature to be 5'10", or not part of my nature to be left-handed. It's true that I'm left-handed. I'm not right-handed, but it's not part of my. I could be something else. It's not. That's something that constrains. So she has this set up, this thing where then it's about this kind of, it's at the soul level, which then leads to things like saying, wait a minute, there are different kinds of souls. There's female souls and male souls, which then goes, oh no, two species. And she does say at some point two species, but she corrects herself later and says it's two different forms of the same ultimate form. But she also says, I love this one line she said at some point in her book on woman, her collection of essays. She says, this isn't as absurd as it sounds. So she recognized, like, I'm moving this way, right? So that's the Stein's vision, is that, that these differentiations between men and women are, you could say, of the nature of the man or woman, of the human, and that explains somehow inside out as opposed to merely the outside in. She is still, I mean, of course, she still thinks she's being Thomas. She talks about Thomas all the time on this, Anima Forma Corporis, but it is different in that way, right?
Yeah. And I think that so one of the things about St. Thomas's account, which is especially satisfying in light of the 20th century or 21st century situation where we are at present, is that you look at a thing and you say, how is that thing sexed or gendered by its material constitution? That's just what it is. Now, mind you, there are limit cases, but they're a very small percentage of the population. So you don't have to like break the rule by reason of the limit. And it's in a certain sense, like the exception kind of proves the rule. Whereas with Stein, there is this kind of anxiety that if you admit some decoupling of, like the spiritual and then the bodily dimension, that you open the door for a whole flood of modern nonsense or contemporary nonsense, which I think, on the one hand, that's kind of ill-founded, because she isn't formulating her theory in with an eye to what we're experiencing at present, the kind of transgender ideology or transgender movement. But she's trying to valorize the experience which is distinct to men and distinct to women, and saying it's not just a matter of matter, which I understand that sentiment, but coming kind of back at it from a Thomistic perspective, something that you like to cite a lot is that when Chesterton describes St. Thomas, he says if he were to have taken like one of those Carmelite sweet genitive add-on names, he would have been St. Thomas of the Creator. So even while we talk about matter as a kind of principle, like you said, of potency or even unintelligibility, there is a profound sense in St. Thomas's understanding where it's very much dignified insofar as it's created by God, and that made to be a body-soul composite, body and soul, that it's the matter there is part of a synthetic, or it's part of, just a composite dignified thing. And so the effects that it can have, even while we may not see our way to them with perfect clarity, they can be themselves, like very worthwhile or very dignified, even though we can't draw all the connections. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so I suppose the danger with Thomas is, at least in that hackneyed Thomas account, is that it reduces gender to nothing. It's just kind of like, actually what's really important to you is your soul and your rational powers, and turns out, man and woman don't really fit it. There's just kind of a contingent fact that you're a man and woman. In fact, you might even think the same anxieties from a philosophical perspective could say, well, if it genders due to my matter, and I can change any of my matter, like wait till science does this, eventually we can even change the genome, perhaps, someone like it's conceivable logically. Well, then I could change gender according to Thomas's account. So it's like both have this. So Thomas has this point where it's like you could say, well, gender isn't really that important to Thomas because it's not. Whereas Stein, I think, as you say, her emphasis is to bring out the differences between the genders. But anytime you make a distinction, it can slide into a division and then a separation, and then so that in distinguishing the genders, you could say, or in a harder way, in a stronger way than Stein does, you get benefits of seeing the differences between men and women and the important complementarity between them. But you also run the problem of like separating the body from the soul in the Cartesian-ish kind of thing, and that runs into the problems too. So I think it's a matter of kind of swinging back and forth in a way, perhaps, between the two, because gender is really important, but so is your body, and gender and your body are related. And the question of whether you want to come kind of top down from that in the Steinian perspective or bottom up with a Thomistic perspective, it might be somewhat a matter of your starting point, and ideally you'd kind of come to something similar. But that's my kind of go on that. But we'll have to leave it here for now. But I hope the important part is that gender does matter, even if it's not matter. Or maybe it is, or maybe it's related. It's obviously related. It's obviously related because there are like male and female parts. Right? We're not going to talk about those. But thanks again to all our supporters. If you'd like to tithe to our work, check out us at patreon.com/Godsplaining. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We still doing TikTok? Maybe TikTok. Sock Hops on TikTok. Coming in. Like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Visit godsplaining.org to shop our merchandise and get dates and information for upcoming Godsplaining events. As mentioned, there's still room for the All-Comers Retreat, talking about the Cardinal Virtues, Joseph Pieper's book, which would be fantastic. If you haven't read that, it's great fun, and it's a great time to be together, sock hop or not. But thanks for all your prayers. Know of us, our prayers for you. Please keep praying for us, and we'll catch you next time on Godsplaining.